When you think of conservation heroes, it's probably humans who come to mind. After all, there are countless people who've dedicated their lives to helping the natural world and its inhabitants. And some of them have become well-known public figures in the process. But what if I told you that some of the most incredible conservationists out there are actually dogs? Today, we're going to be talking about one canine conservationist in particular, a black lab mix named Tucker. Despite the incredible things he'd go on to do, Tucker actually started out in life as a stray, living rough on the streets of Seattle until he was rescued at the age of 6 months, at which point he ended up in an animal shelter in Arlington, Washington. But finding his forever home wasn't easy. Tucker was very high energy and obsessive about toys, and just a little too boisterous to be suitable for life as a family pet. The unfortunate reality is that sometimes, for dogs like Tucker who struggle to find a forever home, they can find themselves facing euthanasia. Of course, some shelters don't put healthy animals to sleep, but sadly in some countries many are overrun with rescues and feel that by getting rid of so-called problem dogs, they're able to focus on rescuing animals who have a higher chance of being adopted. Tucker's story could have ended very differently, but he was lucky. While at the shelter, he caught the attention of an organisation called Conservation Canines. And what is Conservation Canines, you may wonder? Well, it was the brainchild of biologist Samuel. After learning about how dogs were trained to sniff out drugs, he found himself wondering if a similar feat could be achieved in his own field of conservation research. It was the kind of idea that a lot of people probably would have written off as not worth pursuing. But Samuel could see the potential in it and teamed up with expert dog trainers to make it happen. And eventually, with time and work, this culminated in the founding of the Conservation Canines program, part of the University of Washington Center for Conservation Biology, where Samuel worked. The program's dogs were trained the same way as any other detection dog, the only difference being that they were trained to detect endangered animals. Usually, specifically, they were trained to detect the animal's scat, which is the technical term for poop. The scat samples would then be collected and analysed, able to share a wealth of information on species who desperately needed help. Traditional population monitoring included techniques like fitting animals with tracking collars, using camera traps, and capturing animals to take blood samples. Not only did the dogs prove to be much more efficient than all of these alternatives, allowing much more information to be gathered, they also had less of an impact on the animals themselves, as the animals could remain untouched and unaware of the presence of researchers, which meant that their behaviours wouldn't change and potentially give inaccurate results. What started off as an outlandish idea proved to be nothing short of a conservation breakthrough. And it wasn't just the wild animals that were being saved by Conservation Canines either, because every single one of the program's dogs were actually rescues. Many of them came from shelters, though some were surrendered directly to the program by previous owners. And these weren't just regular dogs needing new homes either. Most of them were unsuitable for a typical family environment due to being both incredibly high energy and having an extreme, even obsessive play drive. Many of these dogs were the kind that would be adopted out only to be returned to the shelter shortly after when their owners became overwhelmed. And like I mentioned earlier, if that shelter didn't have a strict no-kill policy, then these dogs would become the first in the firing line. If they stood any chance of thriving, they needed a home that could not only cope with their quirks, but embrace them, and that's exactly what this program offered. The same traits that meant they struggled to fit in as a family pet made them perfect for work in wildlife detection. While Tucker was far from the first dog at Conservation Canines, he was definitely the most famous, and a lot of that stemmed from his work in orca conservation. Trying to study any species of wild animal can be difficult, but that's especially true when it comes to aquatic animals. Even just finding them in the first place can be near impossible at times given the vastness of the world's oceans, and so trying to gather information on them, trying to locate the same individual multiple times, trying to track their movements, it can all be very difficult, but it's considerably easier when you have a dog like Tucker. Just like when he was tracking animals on land, Tucker was trained to locate the smell of the orca's scat and guide his handler to them. But obviously leading a human over water is a lot harder than doing so over land. You can't just drag someone around when you're stuck in a boat, and Tucker was known to despise getting wet, despite how much he loved his job. So instead, he would stand at the bow of the boat, and once he picked up on a scent, which in perfect conditions could be up to a mile away, would communicate its location through his body language. The signals he gave could sometimes be minute, just the slightest tilt of his head or shift of weight. These signs were often so subtle that they could be easily overlooked or misinterpreted, but Tucker's handler Liz Seeley was deeply attuned to Tucker's silent language, and would translate his instructions to the boat's driver. This was done through hand signals so that Tucker wouldn't become distracted by her speaking. It was through this incredible interspecies teamwork that Tucker would lead the conservationists to the scat, and while the scientist was scooping up a sample, Tucker would finally get his reward in the form of playtime with his favourite toy, an orange ball on a rope. Trying to find samples of killer whale scat without a dog is incredibly difficult, as it sinks to the sea floor in only half an hour. Before the dogs came into the picture, they would consider themselves lucky if they got even just 10 samples across an entire year. Once the conservation canines arrived on the scene, that number skyrocketed to about 150 samples a year. Not only did this give them way more information to work with, but it also meant that they could receive samples from the same individual whale over a period of time, which allowed for much more accurate monitoring. And analysing the scat samples allowed for so much to be learned about the orcas living off the coast of the San Juan Islands. They could learn about their hormone levels, the overall health of the animal and any diseases they may have, their stress levels, their genetic makeup, diet, and any number of other physiological data points, as well as monitoring for environmental toxins, and the effects that they may have on the whales. The area the whales lived was a popular spot for whale watching excursions, and some had concerns that the number of boats this brought in might be causing stress. But by analysing the scat, it was found that actually the whales weren't really all that bothered by it. Rather, it showed that the main cause of stress for the orcas was problems with their food supply, as the Chinook salmon they primarily fed on was being affected by commercial fishing and habitat degradation. And having this information enabled conservationists to know where to focus their efforts to best benefit orca populations. By analysing different pollutants in their scat, scientists were also able to determine which whale pods were going off to California for the winter and which were staying closer to home. Tucker dedicated hundreds of hours to the orca research project, and was one of their most successful dogs, accounting for a large percentage of the nearly 350 samples analysed. For a stray dog who could have easily ended up being euthanized for being unadoptable, he had a massive impact on the world of conservation. And while Tucker is most famous for his work with orcas, that wasn't the extent of his contribution to science. He was actually trained to detect the scat of 10 different species, including orcas, and worked in Conservation Canine's other research projects too, tracking down long-eared bats, sharp-tailed snakes, and caribou amongst others. Some dogs at the project were even more prolific than Tucker, able to trace up to 13 different species. Although based in Washington in the US, conservation canines worked around the world, locating the poop of a wide range of different endangered species, including owls, cougars, wolves, giant armadillos, tigers, brown bears, salamanders, wolverines, lynx, iguanas, anteaters, tapirs, and Pacific pocket mice, as well as all the ones I've already mentioned, and plenty more besides, I'm sure. There were also dogs who could locate the nests of sea turtles, allowing for the eggs to be kept safe from poachers, as well as others who could sniff out invasive plant species. Not bad for a bunch of rescue dogs no one else wanted, huh? Tucker retired in 2017 at the age of 13. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find much out there about his life after this, but given that he would now be in his early 20s, I think it's pretty safe to assume that this incredible canine is sadly no longer with us. But what an incredible legacy to leave behind. He did more for the world of wildlife conservation than most of us humans ever could. Tucker's story, and conservation canine's story in general, is such a wonderful example of why it's so important to think outside the box and try new weird things when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. And it also shows how much of an impact one individual can make, regardless of whether or not that individual is even a human. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd Podcast. If you enjoyed it, then it would really mean the world to me if you could support the show in any way that you can. It all really makes a difference. You all know the drill by now. Any and all money made through this podcast goes to the Little Rescue Zoo, which specialises in the rescue of both exotic animals and domestic animals with disabilities, health issues, and behavioural problems. And sometimes exotic animals with those kinds of issues too. So by supporting the show, you're also helping to support their work without having to spend a penny of your own money, which is pretty cool. New episodes of the Animal Nerd podcast come out most Tuesdays, and if you would like a list of sources used for this episode, as well as our email address, social medias, website, all of that stuff, then you can find all of that in the show notes. Thank you again for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one. Stay wild, friends!